So the focus of the webinar today is with the title, Answering the So What Question, Tips for Writing Up Qualitative Research for Publication. I think no matter what discipline we're in, the reality is that most research that's published within any discipline is quantitative research. And qualitative research, while it's grown in popularity and grown in visibility in the last 2 decades, is still lagging behind in terms of how much it appears in general in articles. Obviously, there are specialist journals that focus on qualitative research in different disciplines and different specialist areas. But for those of us who are writing for specialist areas like palliative care, and I also work in disability, it can be quite challenging to successfully publish your qualitative research in those journals. And it can be frustrating during the review process sometimes when questions that you get from reviewers seem to suggest a lack of understanding for qualitative. So we've done some introductions, so it's great to get a sense of the mix of people who are on the webinar today, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments in key places. So just to start with a very clear sense of where I'm going, I'm really going to focus on 5 key tips. Some general tips around writing for peer-reviewed journals generally, and I'll start with those, many of which you'll be very familiar with. But then I'm going to focus on knowing your target journal, mapping your research onto the journal expectations, and also knowing and naming your research effectively, working on the basis that you may be facing reviewers who may not be experienced in qualitative research, and it's an additional challenge for us to be clear around our research in that context. But the main take-home message that I want you to take on board from the beginning is really the easiest way to maximize your chances of publishing qualitative research is actually designing your research in line with published standards for qualitative from the outset. And there's a number of systems that I'm sure many of you are familiar with that I'm going to comment on in the middle of the presentation. But just to start with writing for peer review, I'm not a fan of writing for peer review. I quite like writing methodology, I like writing results, but I find the overall journal article production process challenges me in ways that I'm less comfortable with. Writing introductions, writing discussions is not my natural place. I'm a methodologist by background. So I think it's really important that we recognize that writing for peer-reviewed journals is like all other skills. It takes time to develop, and it takes effort and work. But really the best way to develop that skill is to be writing, is to be submitting papers, is to be receiving reviews and responding to them. A few general tips that many of you will be familiar with: be realistic about timeframes and processes. It can be a number of months between initial submission to your paper being accepted, depending on the revision process. Be prepared for rewriting and revision. I often say to my own students, I'm a better editor than I am a writer, so I quite enjoy that revision and editing process. But it's almost unheard of that papers are accepted in their submitted format. So be prepared for that. And the other thing is be prepared for the almost emotional human reaction that you can sometimes have to the reviews that we get as part of the reviewing process. Some of you will be very familiar with the reviewer 2 memes online, and the idea that reviewer 2 is often the person who swings in with some very strange comments and suggestions. But to be honest, in my experience, I've never had a reviewer give feedback that felt anything other than their absolute honest views on my paper. So be prepared for how you will read those reviews and be prepared for the process of responding to them. Another area that I've learned a lot from is actually being involved in reviewing. And if you do get the opportunity to be involved in reviewing, do take that opportunity and put the effort into it and develop those skills as well, because it will give you a huge insight into the process. But I think my last 2 general tips in this area are ones that you will have heard from supervisors and colleagues and collaborators, which is create a network of peers and other advisors who can support you with your writing. I work with many collaborators, but there's 3 or 4 people in particular that I write with and I write together with. And whether we're working on the same paper or whether we're working in parallel on different papers. I find them a huge resource and support to me in terms of getting their feedback on drafts, getting help sometimes with tricky elements of a paper, particularly those situations where you're trying to find the real take-home message to really clarify that at the end. So having an outside view can sometimes be very helpful. And obviously for those of you who are PhD students or hope to be doing a PhD, your supervisor as an experienced colleague is a really important part of developing this skill. And also that shared experience can help minimize the stress of rejection. So just some general tips there to keep in mind. Just picking up on the issue of writing as a key skill, if you Google sort of academic writing, writing for review in Google Scholar, there's actually quite a number of papers that have been written in different disciplines capturing this idea of writing as a skill. And I was just struck by this particular paper by Johnson from the Journal of the American Academy of Dermatology. And again, not necessarily a journal you might read in your specialist area, but I was really struck by some of the really interesting points that this paper made. You know, Johnson comments that there's no single best way to write or get started. It varies from paper to paper and from person to person. For example, for me, sometimes I just need to sit down and, you know, start from a student's thesis or from a report I've written and really just chop that document down to the rough shape and size of the article that it will become. So it's really about knowing what works for you. Do you like to start at the introduction? Do you like to start at the results? And Johnson picks up on that. I mean, he recommends that the sequence should be method, results, discussion, and introduction, which I think actually makes sense because it allows you to shape the introduction to reflect what comes through in the paper. And then the last quote that I've shared here, again, really reinforces some of the points I made on the previous slide. Becoming an excellent rewriter is fundamental to being a good writer. And think about your paper through the eyes of someone who's reading it for the first time. I think that can be one of the challenges, particularly for qualitative research, because as researchers, we live that process. We've been intimately involved with the analysis, the interpretation. As a PhD student or as a lead researcher, you will have been intimately involved in gathering the data, conducting the interviews, doing the observations. To you, it's familiar, but think of the reviewer who has never read this paper before and who's reading it for the first time. So, key message here is that there are lots of tips on writing in the academic literature. And again, sometimes they're in odd journals and not necessarily in your area, but do use some of these as a resource. Focusing specifically on qualitative research, I came across this paper from 2012, and Margaret Sandalowski is a well-known name in qualitative research, particularly in health. And I found this was a really interesting paper, just in terms of reinforcing some of the key tips and key messages that I would often share with students about writing generally. I pulled out one particular quote here because I thought it was some food for thought. So in a few moments, I'm going to say a little bit about existing standards for writing and reporting qualitative research. But what Sandalowski and Lehman say is they criticize some of these structures, some of these systems, and say that beyond the vague mandate that findings should be clear, writers of qualitative health research reports have received relatively little guidance on how to accomplish this clarity, and even less on how to present findings that are usable. So, for example, in this paper, the authors argue that you have to think about synthesizing or summarizing your findings, and they refer to this as translating it into thematic statements, and then translating that into a language of intervention and implementation. And sometimes that can be hard because the qualitative analysis process is intense. It is about synthesizing, reducing, distilling the very key messages. But often when you've written a long form report or you've written a thesis where word count wasn't an issue, trying to further synthesize or further clarify those take-home messages can actually be quite challenging. So I think it's interesting that they focus on this idea of thematic statements to really isolate the key messages. So this is a paper that I would definitely recommend, and I was very relieved to see that a lot of the things that I was going to talk to you about today were present in that paper, so I would definitely recommend it. So in terms of the writing process, then it is simply, writing is something that some of us do well. Writing is something that some people work hard at. Writing is something that some people don't enjoy, and writing is something that others do enjoy. Know how you write and know what works for you in terms of writing. Now, I'm not going to take any questions there just because it's a more general. What I want to do, keeping in mind time, is to move on to some of the more specific tips that I would like to share with you this morning around writing your qualitative research for publication. And I'm going to focus for the next section on the target journal and knowing your target journal and knowing their expectations. I think in the last 10 years, if not more, researchers, even very early stage researchers, have become much more aware of the importance of careful choice of journals in terms of the desired audience that you want to reach. And it can be challenging because sometimes we receive messages about impact factors, but other times it's important to think about the key audience. But whichever reason you choose a journal, when you're writing qualitative research, you really have to look at what that journal says and presents about qualitative research. So I'm going to focus on a number of small exercises that I did in getting ready for the webinar to highlight some of these issues of picking journals and deciding on backup journals. Always have your top 3 journals and work through them. And then I'm going to say a little bit about looking at the instructions for authors from those journals. So in preparation for today, I just pulled a list of journals from Web of Science that had the word palliative in them. So these in alphabetical order are the journals that came up. I've excluded current opinion because it's more review paper, so it was less relevant. But these 8 journals, as you can see, range in terms of their impact factor from 0.5 all the way up to 3.7. You'll all be familiar with them, again, ranging from including open access journals and journals based in the US, based in Europe, but all very widely read within the palliative care community. So what do these journals have to say about qualitative research, and what do they include? So just I first did a bit of a search in their instructions for authors, and I searched for the word qualitative in their guidelines. Now, sometimes when qualitative didn't come up, I searched for interviews, or I searched for focus groups, or I searched for just what they said about design. And it was really interesting to see the variety. So the American Journal of Hospice and Palliative Medicine, the word qualitative doesn't appear in their guidelines, but they do reference the Equator Network. And I'll come back to the Equator Network and what they have to say about qualitative research. Interestingly, for both BMC Palliative Care and BMJ Supportive and Palliative Care, the word qualitative doesn't appear in their guidelines. But as you'll see in a moment, all of these journals included qualitative research. The Journal of Hospice and Palliative Nursing had some nice additional information for those writing qualitative research. But if you look at this quote from their guidelines, it focuses really on some of the classic risks in qualitative research, the potential identifiability of individuals in small-scale studies. So they mention describing group data rather than individual pen pictures, which is interesting because often as qualitative researchers, we're encouraged to create a very rich picture of the participants so that the reader can judge who they may reflect or who they may represent. But obviously, from a publication point of view, there is a concern about anonymity. The other thing this journal says, which again you might be surprised by, is not tagging quotations with participant numbers. And this is something that I would often say to my students, but goes against what a lot of articles would do in publication. So not tagging the ID number to a participant quote means that you can't link quotes. And again, if you can link quotes, the risk is that you make participants identifiable. So I think it's interesting that the comment that's in this journal's guidelines focuses on some of the ethical or identifiability issues for participants. Moving on, the Journal of Palliative Care, as you can see, the word qualitative doesn't appear, but they do reference the Equator Network. Journal of Palliative Medicine, the word qualitative doesn't appear at all. And then for palliative and supportive care and palliative medicine, both provide information. Palliative and supportive care refers to well-designed quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods research studies. So they're naming that they want to include qualitative. And then palliative medicine, which is one of the most technically detailed guidelines for authors of qualitative research, refers to the COREQ guidelines for qualitative research, which I'm going to come on to, and then has this additional detail where they clarify some of the areas that they want clear information on. And this has been my experience of papers that I've reviewed and written. They're looking for very clear information on the approach or design of your qualitative research, that epistemological and ontological position, how that relates to your question. And they refer to this thick description and interpretation of the findings. So again, they're highlighting some of the methodological standards that they have. I think it's interesting that they exclude participants' quotations from the word count, and they very clearly indicated that they want them integrated into the text. And this will vary from journal to journal. So I think palliative medicine is very explicit in what it looks for, whereas other journals either don't mention qualitative or don't articulate what those expectations are. And this is one of the challenges that we face as writers of qualitative research for journal articles or for journal publication, is that there is possibly some unwritten expectations or some unwritten presentations. So how can we, if the instructions for authors are unclear, how can we prepare ourselves most effectively? And for me, there are lots of sources of information that can guide us. So this is from the website of the National Library of Medicine. This is actually one of the links that palliative medicine refer to in terms of it's a list of organisational guidelines for publication. And they link to the Equator Network, which I'll come on to, and they also link into things like the APA style of citations, and it links into other standards for qualitative and quantitative research. So again, there's broader sources of information out there. But the main recommendation that I would make to anybody writing for any journal of any style of methodology is to look to the journal and to look at recent studies that are similar to yours. So for those 8 journals that I looked at, I simply did a search for articles that had the word qualitative in the abstract, and I sorted the papers by date, and I picked the most recent publication. So I just want to highlight a few messages for you that struck me when I was doing this. So again, the journals are in alphabetical order. So this is a paper from September 2018 from the American Journal of Hospice and Palliative Care. And it's a study looking at nurses and physicians' experiences of the withdrawal of life-sustaining therapy. So identified very clearly in the abstract as a qualitative investigation. You'll see that the approach, a phenomenological approach is mentioned, and they clearly identify that interviews are used and that an inductive approach to data analysis was used. So you've got those sort of high points in the abstract. I think it's interesting that they don't tell us how many participants took part in the abstract. We know they were drawn from 2 medical centres. And that's something I'm going to pick up on is later on is some of the expectations around standards for sample size. This is a paper from BMC Palliative Care. So remember, some of these journals didn't indicate qualitative papers. This is from, again, 2018, and it's an analysis of facilitators and barriers to advanced care planning after discharge based on patient interviews. And in the abstract, we can see that, again, under the methods, we're told that there was interviews conducted. Again, that methodology isn't named. We're told that the interviews were transcribed, but we are told they're analysed with thematic analysis. And as you can see just at the bottom of the slide there were 17 interviews in total. So 17 interviews with frail elderly patients. And this is something to think about with your studies in terms of sample size, is that the nature of the sample will set the benchmark for sample size. If you're talking to professionals who are relatively easy to access, there may be higher expectations for your sample size. But if you're talking with people who are vulnerable or need lots of support to engage in the interview process, you may find that smaller studies are more readily acceptable because of the challenge involved. So 17 interviews here just conducted with frail elderly individuals. BMJ supportive and palliative care, again, a recent paper here looking at volunteers and their roles. Massive difference in sample size here. 79 people participated in the study, a qualitative study that used both focus groups and interviews. And again, in the paper, they break it down. But often you'll see that the expectation for focus group studies is that there's a higher sample, clearly because the data collection allows for that more simply. But less information in the abstract here about things like the design, the qualitative approach being used. Journal of Hospice and Palliative Nursing, again, another study with professionals, home care nurses' experiences. And we can see that there were 2 focus groups of interviews followed by in-depth interviews. And again, not given a clear sense of the overall sample size, and not given a huge amount of information on the methodology, but again, based on a hermeneutic methodology. I think what's interesting with this is it highlights something I'll come back to, which is the challenge of writing qualitative when you have multiple sources of data or where you have multiple methods of data collection. Journals, I think in my experience, are becoming more inclined to ask questions about how you integrated that, and I'll come back to that at the end. Nearly at the end of our examples, so this is a study from the Czech Republic, again a qualitative study looking at the unmet needs of patients. Again, a relatively large sample size here, but it's a combination of 19 in-depth interviews and 4 focus groups, so a total of 54 respondents. And it's got that mix of patients, family members, and professionals. But again, clarification on the design here that grounded theory was used. Journal of Palliative Medicine, I thought this was an interesting paper. Again, one of the challenges can be the so what question. What is this paper about? And I think obviously in palliative care, the issue of spirituality and the spiritual aspects of care and coping is something that can be of great interest to some journals. So here we've got semi-structured interviews with 46, what they describe as surrogates. So these are taking part, these are people who are authorized to make decisions on behalf of critically ill patients. So we know that these are individuals who may be involved in caring for those. So again, there may be additional challenges in supporting this group, but it's a substantial sample size for anyone doing qualitative analysis. Palliative and supportive care, another professional study. And actually a more familiar sample size, I think, for many people here. 21 eligible healthcare professionals and 20 took part in the study. And again, you can see we're told it was a qualitative interview study, but we're not given a huge amount of information about the methodology. And then palliative medicine, I mean, obviously from the impact factors, the highest impact factor in the journals that I looked at. And there was a very interesting Meet the Expert session at the AIIHPC last year with the editor of Palliative Medicine talking about qualitative studies. And it was a very interesting session to be at in terms of hearing from an editor about those issues of clarity in your methodology, clarity in your approach. And we can see here that the design is very explicitly named in line with those guidelines from the journal webpage. And as you can see, 19 people with chronic breathlessness. So again, a relatively small sample, but one who may have needed a lot of support. So it's really important that you take time to look at sample qualitative studies in the target journals that you've identified for your own work, so that you can see whether it's explicit in the guidelines or not. What are the types of studies that have been published recently? How are they being presented? How are they being described? And how can you increase your chances of publication by being aware of their expectations? So just a few points to remember on selecting journals, apart from this specialist issue. You know, often it can be challenging to pick the journals that you want to target. And I am a believer in identifying the journal that will reach the audience you most want to achieve. Who is your paper written for? But generally, Where are the articles you're citing being published? Those journals may be more interested in your work. Develop a list of possible journals and rank them based on factors that are important to you, and be prepared to work down through that list. And it might not be a list of 3, it might need to be a list of 5. I do think we need to be good at recognizing when a paper maybe isn't going to be published, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try our best before we get to that point. As I said, look at several recent issues of possible journals. Find the information about the aims and scope and look for what they say, if anything, about qualitative. What are the style guidelines? A particular area that you'll see referenced in journals that do go into detail is, do they want the quotes integrated into the text, or do they want them in tables? And that can be a very different way of writing. As I said, look at similar papers from recent issues, and ultimately be realistic about acceptance and rejection rates in journals. Be realistic that for many journals now, they are identifying papers that are not suitable for review. It's an improvement for us because it increases the turnaround time. But it also does mean that if your paper gets to a journal that doesn't review high rates of submissions and yours goes to review, they have seen value in it. And it may be that the revise and resubmit that you've received, that you read as a rejection, is actually them highlighting that they do see value. Okay, so the second set of tips that I want to focus on is these two. So know and name your research effectively, and the most important message, where you can design your research in line with published standards. So what do I mean by published standards? So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Equator Network, but on the off chance that you're not, this is a one-stop shop, as you can see, for writing and publishing health research. It's a database of reporting guidelines for pretty much almost any study that you can imagine, including, and it's not mentioned here, but there are some excellent guidelines for mixed methods here. But you will have seen in the journal guidelines that a number of the journals refer to the Equator Network. And what they are looking for you to do is to include a checklist with your submission, and palliative medicine in particular asks for this. They're looking for you to include a checklist to show how you have addressed what are common standards. So as you can see down the bottom of the screen there, there's 2 reporting guidelines that are mentioned, the SRQR and COREQ. And I just want to say a little bit about these. So COREQ is based on a paper by Tong et al. From 2007, so not a recent publication. And this is a set of criteria that were developed as a checklist for interviews and focus groups. And if you're familiar with this paper, you'll know that they conducted a search of a variety of databases to look at qualitative studies and the existing checklists that were used to assess their quality. And they found 22 different checklists, and they synthesized these into 3 key domains. And again, a number of journals expect you to submit a document. It's not necessarily going to be published or supplemental, but to submit a document where you indicate how you have addressed each of these. So I'm not going to go into detail on them, but I just want to highlight some key ones. So under COREQ, domain 1 focuses on the research team and reflexivity. And it goes into real detail on factors that you may think are quite simplistic, but really position the paper in terms of who was involved. So what experience or training did the researcher have? If this is your PhD and you were developing your skills, what sort of training did you have in focus group moderation or facilitation? What did the participants know about the researcher, and what characteristics were reported about the interviewer or the facilitator? So that idea of naming biases, naming assumptions. And again, when you look at standard qualitative checklists, they do highlight this issue of identifying the researcher's own perspective. But you will never ever see in a quantitative study a researcher tell you that they're a positivist or a post-positivist or a postmodernist. But with qualitative research, we are expected to reflect on and to name the positions that we take, maybe the connection that we have to the subject. And again, this is one way of thinking about that. The second domain in COREQ, I think, is the one where we often have this information to hand, but in my experience of writing journal articles, while the methodology is the most important part of any study because it's what we did and how we did it, it's often the smallest part of the paper. And often when people are sacrificing word count, they sacrifice it here. But I think what COREQ highlights is that you actually might be cutting your nose off to spite your face, for want of a better saying, to undermine or to reduce the detail in the methodology. Because look at what's being asked. Again, your methodological orientation. How were your participants selected and approached? How many refused to participate or dropped out, and why? The setting of your data collection. Was anyone else present beside the participants and the researchers? What are the characteristics of your sample? But bearing in mind that one of the journals we looked at highlighted that you need to share this information without making your participants identifiable. One area where I get a lot of revision requests or advice around revisions is around that balance of how much do I tell them about the interview and where it came from. You know, were the questions based on the literature? And now the journals offer supplementary information and allow you to upload files that might not appear in the hard copy print, but will be available. It's not unusual to see interview questions being provided. You'll see here the mention of saturation. I am going to come back to saturation as probably one of the most challenging issues in writing for publication. But again, this is the type of expectation that this framework has. And then finally, domain 3 for COREQ is analysis and findings. And as you can see, looking for very specific information about how many people coded the data, were themes inductive or deductive, what software was used, was there any participant checking, and then obviously in terms of reporting, clarity of themes, particularly structures of major and minor themes. So that's COREQ, one of the sets of criteria that palliative medicine name as their expectation. And again, if this isn't something that you're familiar with, it can be very, very helpful. The other one I do want to mention, though, is the O'Brien et al. Paper, which is also mentioned in the Equator Network. And this is a more recent publication from academic medicine. And actually, I would have used COREQ for many, many years. But when I came across this paper, I have to admit that this has replaced COREQ in my affections. Again, a similar methodology in terms of how these criteria were developed. They reviewed they reviewed published papers. They were looking for standards or checklists for reporting qualitative. And they've come up with 21 items. So maybe one of the reasons I like it is because there's fewer items than in COREQ. But actually what I like about this structure is how it sort of breaks down. It's very similar if you've done systematic reviews and you're familiar with the PRISMA guidelines. SRQR is very similar in its structure. And again, it is just guiding you around, you know, your title. Have you made it clear in your title that this is a qualitative study? Many papers don't. Does your abstract summarize the key elements? And for example, when we looked at those different papers, they varied in terms of how much detail they gave. Again, the main focus is around the methodology, naming your approach, naming the researcher characteristics, having that reflexive piece of where you sit in the study. Your context, your sampling, ethical issues, data collection. Again, none of this is new to any of us who do qualitative research, but do we take the time to name these areas in our writing? And again, for palliative medicine, I discovered SRQR because I was submitting to palliative medicine, and the experience of doing this checklist was really helpful in terms of saying, yes, this is done on this page, this is done here. And as I said, my main take-home message is going to be using these standards to design your research. But you may not have known about them, you may not have come across them, but they can still be used as a really helpful tool to benchmark your paper to make sure that where you can address these criteria that you have. This is just the second half of the SRQR system, as you can see, getting into data analysis. And the language I like here, so rather than reliability and credibility, they're talking about techniques to enhance trustworthiness. What have you done in your process to reassure the reader that this isn't a biased personal interpretation of the data that has been informed by everything in your life that's gone before and not the research process. Coming back to some of the questions that were asked about mixed methods and multiple qual method studies, again, they focus on synthesis and interpretation. To me, qualitative writing and qualitative analysis is, the analogy I use is, it's like making a sauce. If any of you are chefs, a sauce starts off with lots of volume and very little flavour. You've got herbs, you've got spices, you've got flavouring, and you've got a pot of water. And your job is to actually, you know, reduce that down to this thick, rich, flavourful sauce. But a sauce in which you can still taste the different spices and herbs. You can still get the flavours, but it's reduced in volume, but it's increased in intensity. And to me, that's what a good qualitative set of results are. It's synthesized, it's distilled. So it's really something to think about. I think it's interesting that there's only 2 points about findings, but this is where you convince the reader of the importance or the meaning or relevance of your question. And then I think you'll be familiar with the other discussion points that are there. So SRQR and COREQ are specified by Equator, which is specified by journals as checklists for qualitative research. So it's interesting to think as to whether you've used these before, whether you're familiar with them, or whether you could use them in the future. So the last section of the webinar I wanted to use to highlight what I think are some of the key issues in qualitative articles. And these hold for design, but also for writing. And I've focused on 4: your qualitative design, your sampling, your method of analysis, and your synthesis of results. So in terms of qualitative design, anyone who engages with qualitative research knows that there is a multiverse of designs out there and names of designs. And sometimes they look different and sometimes they look the same. I mean, on the slide here, I've just named some of the basic designs that I will teach in my, what I call Methods 101 course. You know, we're very familiar with phenomenology, grounded theory, and action research, and these are commonly chosen designs, but there's layers to them. So depending on which approach you've taken to phenomenology, whether you're using Sharma's approach to grounded theory or traditional Glasser and Strauss, it's really important that you can name your design and that you know and name your design. Discourse analysis and ethnography, also common methods in palliative care. But again, there's subtleties to these approaches. There's layers and variations. And it is really important that you can very quickly and succinctly name your design, but also be very clear on what that means for your analysis, what that means for your position. An ethnographic study involves the researcher immersing themselves within a context to study it. So you have to, in your article, reflect on your success or failure in immersing yourself. You know, are you of a similar age, gender, sociocultural status to the group within which you're trying to immerse? So knowing these designs, and more importantly, knowing the implications it has for your study and being able to share that concisely with the reader will help them to see where you're coming from. There is nothing worse than reading a paper that says this was a qualitative study with no other detail on the design. But how do you do it in a way that's concise? Being clear on your method of data collection. Now, obviously, we just looked at some abstracts there, and those papers do go on to give a bit more detail. But qualitative research uses a multitude of incredibly flexible and responsive methods. Interviews and focus groups are the ones you've seen most commonly in those examples of papers that we looked at. But we may be using observations, we may be analysing case notes, we may be looking at correspondence. But it's about being very clear in the data collection method and what that meant. So again, in interviews, what was the structure of the interview? What was the approach that was taken? With focus groups, was there any particular techniques that you used? And I've just flagged there about the need to give particular consideration for multiple qualitative methods. I mean, Deborah, you had asked about that. And I think the reality is that it requires even more clarity, both in terms of why you did it, how you did it, and most importantly, how did you integrate those? Did you just treat it all as one set of data and you analysed it independent of method? Did you analyse it in 2 groups and then do a mapping exercise? All of those things need to be considered. In a recent study I was involved in, we interviewed dyads, individuals with significant mental health difficulties and a nominated family member. And we chose to analyse those dyads as a single case. So we had 6 dyads. and we analysed dyad by dyad. We didn't do all of the individuals with mental health difficulties and then all of the family members. We wanted to look at the intricate connections between the individual with the difficulties and their family member and their experiences. So we analysed them as a unit, and we had to be very clear on that in preparing that for publication. I want to say a little bit about sample size, because I think it is one of the biggest challenges at the moment. I find myself being incredibly frustrated when I have interviewed 20 families of children with really rare, unusual, life-limiting neurodevelopmental disabilities, and I've managed to get 10% of the population on the landmass, and a reviewer comes back and tells me that it's a very small study and could I not access a larger sample. So there is this debate in Qualitative about how many qualitative interviews is enough. And if you haven't come across this report by Baker and Edwards, I really recommend you read it. This was a series of interviews with both expert and early career researchers about how many interviews do you need in a study. And what I like about this is it hasn't tried to synthesize and come up with an answer. It shares the views of each of the participants as to highlight the variation. And I really like this quote from Walcott in this report. And those of you who've used Qualitative will know Walcott is a very well-known researcher in this area. And his answer is, it depends. But you can't really say that to a journal. Now, he goes on to say it depends on your resources, the question, how many respondents will satisfy committee members for a dissertation or reviewers for a paper, I would add. But it is really, he raises this issue of the old rule seems to hold that you keep asking as long as you are getting different answers. And it's not about frequency of responses, it's range of responses. Now, that raises the issue of saturation, which I'll come back to in a moment. But all I can say to you is I look to journals. The journals I want to publish in, what sample sizes are they reporting? What size studies are they doing? And how does mine compare to that? And it's not that it has to be the same, but do you need to make an argument about why your number is enough? Another paper that I think you'll find very helpful, this is an online journal, FQS. It's a social research electronic journal. And this paper by Mark Mason is really good in terms of looking at sample size and saturation. And this was looking at PhD studies, so it could be very meaningful for some of you. And what they found by looking across over 500 studies, the average sample size was 31. But actually there was huge variation in terms of the sample sizes. And they go on to discuss this issue of saturation. And I want to mention saturation because it is probably the word that I've gotten back more from reviewers. Did you engage with saturation? So saturation, I'm sure you're all familiar with, is this idea that we collect data until no new themes emerge. And anybody who knows me knows that I don't agree with this as a principle. To me, your time for data collection is often boundaried by very practical factors like you have 3 years to do your PhD, your funder is funding you for a year, there are 80 people in the organization and that's as many people as you can get. Saturation suggests that we're almost analysing our data as we go, and while some qualitative techniques encourage that, others will say that actually that can bias the data collection process, that if you're looking for patterns as you interview, could you be biasing that process? Personally, I prefer to analyse my data once it's all collected. But that doesn't mean that you can't be clear about what influenced your awareness of patterns in the data, and not from the point of view of no new themes emerge, because there's always something new. But if you look back at that quote by Walcott, that idea that you're getting different answers, are you getting variation in your data? Walcott's quote highlights that variation is okay. It's good to have that range of responses. Whereas saturation seems to suggest that we don't like variation, that we want there to be nothing new emerging. We want those patterns there. And I mentioned this article because it's a really useful article to be able to make an argument for why you didn't use saturation. And again, this is one of the things I would say about writing articles, qualitative research for publication. Sometimes you have to give arguments. You have to give a rationale for why you did something. you know, in quantitative research, again, no one is ever going to be asked to write an argument for why they used randomization of assignments. But in qualitative, because reviewers are less familiar, you may have to give them the basis on which to trust your choice. And papers like this paper by O'Reilly and Parker is one that I use to build an argument in advance of that feedback from the reviewer as to why saturation, while a common concept in qualitative, may not be relevant to my study. So be prepared to make those arguments. I think the other area where we struggle in published research is your analysis method. Now, selecting your analysis method is challenging in qualitative because you have this world of names and brands and types of analysis. And when you really look at them, a lot of them seem the same. And, you know, these are some key points that I say to my students. You know, qualitative analysis exists on a continuum from very structured to very unstructured methods. And there's lots written out there. I'm a big fan of Colin Robson's real world research, and he goes into nice detail about different methods. But one of the points that I'm struck by from him is that there's no clear and accepted set of conventions for analysis. So when you're designing a qualitative study, you know that you have to deal with the data systematically, and you know that you have to be able to describe that method for the reader. So for an article, you're having to do all of that, again, with a handful of word count. And I think one of the key things is to be able to reference the methods. And again, if you look at good qualitative papers, they will name the method of analysis and they will reference it. And if they have the space, they will give you the sort of high points of the process. Again, just to let the reader see what process you've gone through. Now, there are lots of different ways of thinking about methods of qualitative analysis. This is a framework from Robson, where he categorizes them based on the level of interpretation. Is it high interpretation or low? And also the level of inductive versus deductive analysis, where the themes are either developed in advance deductively or they've been identified as they emerge from the data. Though I am always struck, for those who are fans of Braun and Clark's model, which I'm going to come on to, Braun and Clark are very active on Twitter, and they recently had a discussion which was, themes do not emerge from data. It is not that easy. The work that's involved to identify those themes and bring them from the data is the opposite of simple emerging, like Venus from the waters. So just be aware of your language, but you may be dealing with the reviewer who's not familiar. And can you clarify again, what's the level of interpretation? What's the level of inductive versus deductive? What influence the themes? And I'll come back to the idea of how can you ensure credibility. I do want to mention thematic analysis, mainly because it's a method that I think is a very accessible, but also very credible method. You see it much more now being cited, particularly in health research. And Braun and Clark would be very clear that they didn't invent thematic analysis, but they have presented a very clear, transparent, detailed process, which reviewers like. In my experience, they like that you can name a method, that you can cite it, and that you can comment on its use. But there's something hidden in their work that I want to highlight for you, because I think, to me, this is the qualitative difference in qualitative writing. The final phase of Braun and Clark's model talks about writing the report as the final phase of analysis. And this has been picked up by others, such as Howitt. And it's the idea that actually when you're writing your results, your findings can shift, not hugely, but actually your understanding of the narrative, the story of your thesis can change. The story of the article can change as you write, particularly when you're writing for word count. And this is a very long quote from this article, but for me, if you ask me what's the magic trick, what is the key thing to make my research most likely to be published, they have captured it. So the sections in bold are my high writing. So read this quote. You have to convince the reader of the merit and validity of your analysis. The reviewer has to trust what you've done. You have to give them a concise, coherent, logical, non-repetitive, and interesting account of the story the data tell. No one will ever challenge a statistician to be interesting. But with qualitative research, there is that expectation. You have to provide sufficient evidence of the themes within the data. You must reassure the reader of your interpretation, the credibility of it, by showing them those quotes. And then the second to last piece is the one that actually challenges me and excites me. Extracts need to be embedded within an analytic narrative that compellingly illustrates the story you are telling about your data. And that's where qualitative research can fall down. That word, compelling. You have to catch the reader's interest. And ultimately, you have to make an argument in relation to your research question. So in writing your results for an article for 5,000 words or 3,000 words, can you achieve this in that space? Can you be clear about that narrative, that story? And can you be clear that the process is trustworthy and credible? So if you can do that, you're actually absolutely fine and will have no difficulties, but this is hard. And I think, we do have to think about the rigor and credibility of our analysis. We know that qualitative is criticized for being subjective, but there are techniques that you can use that can inform and reassure the reader, whether it's using reliability, whether it's using multiple researchers, whether it's using, a reflective process to discuss your data with your supervisor, but make sure that you clarify what you've done. The other one that you'll often get asked about is respondent validation. Did you go back to your participants with your findings and get their views on it? I've argued against that because I think sometimes it's difficult for participants because you're asking them to say whether your interpretation of the data reflects their lived experience, but it's your interpretation of the data, and sometimes we have to be very comfortable with that. But it is about having a process for that. The other thing I want to highlight is the impact of models and the benefits of a well-placed, eye-catching model to help talk the reader through your findings. Again, to avoid that theme quote, overwhelming narrative text-based structure. This is from a study by Ruth Davidson, which was looking at the impact of chronic heart disease on children who don't have the disease. So in a family where there's a child with chronic heart disease, what's the siblings' perspectives on this? And you can see that this is just simply summarizing the key findings under each of the questions, but then highlighting that there were some other unexpected themes that emerged. This is another example by a fantastic researcher I worked with, Angela Kelly. And what Angela was able to do was to actually use the visuals to send a very clear message. What this model was trying to say was that it was looking at bereavement in disability, and it was saying that children with disabilities have a mixed understanding of bereavement, and that understanding will drive their capacity to cope. It will influence and push, and that capacity to cope will drive the resources that are needed. So the idea of using the cogs was part of the message of the model. Another example from Angela's thesis was she was very influenced by a particular theory, Bronfenbrenner's theory of development. And she, as part of her final level of analysis, she filtered her findings through Bronfenbrenner's model to see whether her findings reflected that idea of context. And this was the starting place for her findings. So she started by giving the reader an overview of what her findings were, and then she gave the detail, but constantly linking back to the model. So I think for us in qualitative, we should be challenged to try and visualize our work and to visualize our findings, because that again will help with that impact factor. And there are some articles out there to help. This is a really interesting paper from the International Journal of Qualitative Methods by Verdinelli and colleagues. And this is looking at how we display data in qualitative research. So I think challenging us to actually raise our game in some ways, to move beyond the very text-based style of qualitative, to try and represent. And it can be something as simple as you've interviewed professionals and family members. Use a Venn diagram to show how those two groups share or don't share their experiences, what are unique and what are shared experiences. If you have different methods, you've interviews and focus groups, is there any sense that what's being said in a group setting is different to what's being said in an individual setting? So definitely challenging yourself to really engage with your data, with your findings in a way that is different, can make you stand out. Okay, so there are my key points. So I'm not going to do questions or comments here, but I'm just going to revisit those take-home messages and then open it out for some discussion. So what I've tried to do is to capture sort of key tips for maximizing your chances of qualitative publication by getting you to think about writing in general, and how you write and how you like to write. The journal, knowing the journal that you're targeting and knowing their expectations of qualitative research, but ultimately knowing your research so well that you can really share it with someone who may not be familiar with qualitative at all. They're definitely not familiar with your research, but they may not be familiar with qualitative research. And how do you name your research effectively and reassure the reader of that? And as I said, the take-home message for me is, where you can, we should be designing our research with these standards in mind. But where we can't, we should be using these standards to benchmark the way in which we report it back. Okay, so that's me. I will step out of the shared screen now, and hopefully we have some time for any questions and comments.